Welcome to today's topic where we're going to talk about perfectionism. And this is one of the things I've been looking forward to talk about because there's so much misunderstanding, so much misperception about what perfectionism is. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. What really is behind the concept, what does it mean, and what are the benefits? So again, welcome to the last comers. Please mute your microphones. We'll open up for questions and answers afterwards. While you do that, I'm going to then switch on to the slideshow. Let's see if we can find it. There we go. And we are ready to rock and roll. So part of what we're going to be talking about is we're going to define the concept of perfectionism, and then we're going to also talk about the drivers behind it. But even more important, you as a leader, how can you lead and motivate people who are driven by the perfectionism motive? So let's dive into it and see what we got. Got a little bit of an issue here. So perfectionism is one of the things that I have come across where there's a lot of misunderstandings. A lot of people think it's related to people who are really enjoying details, but that is not the reason. The reason people with perfectionism work so much with details is because they have a fear of failure. But we often also somehow connect it to different meanings. I work a lot in recruiting, some of you know, and we will hear that people, they have to be perfectionists, but when they then get a perfectionist, they don't understand what are the drivers behind. So they get somebody who actually is it, and then suddenly they don't like what they get because they get something else than they expected or what they meant. So is it attention to detail or is it a perfectionist? Those are two very different people, and that's what we will be talking about as well. What we got to understand, and this is vital, and this is why I put it on top of the list, is that perfectionism is typically connected to very high quality performance. So if you understand how to lead and manage perfectionists well, you're going to have high performers with a very high quality output. It is also the people that you potentially can stress and provide stress and burnout if you overload them with tasks. And this is again what we're going to be talking about at the end, how to actually lead, but first we're going to define what it is. Perfectionism is also that it's people who need positive feedback from others. They need that in order to build their positive self-image. So they don't have it by autopilot. They get it contextually from the feedback they get, which is why they want things to be perfect, and they for sure want to avoid any kind of mistake. That also means that, again, since last Monday, we've been talking a lot about these intrinsic motives. And today it is the core of this session, is about the motive called social acceptance. So I just found this one on the internet. I was Googling a little bit, and I really like it because here you see some of the negatives. But what you don't get here is, if you look in the middle, that the enormous focus on results. The challenge might be that the standards are so high. Here in this illustration, they said unrealistic, and we can always argue. But when we start aiming for more than 100%, and 100% is not good enough, yes, it becomes unrealistic because there is no such thing as more than 100%. And this means that people driven by this will be very, very result driven. They want to deliver the very best they can. However, they're also highly critical of themselves and their work. And even when you give them positive feedback, they may reject it because if they're not happy, it's not good enough. And again, there are a couple of things in the sort of behind that trailing, which is the fear of failure, but also could mean procrastination. If I'm not sure how to do this so that I risk making a mistake, I better not start. Again, they are very feedback driven. So as a leader, you're gonna give them a lot of feedback. But again, we're gonna come back to that at the end of this session. So just I thought it was kind of a fun illustration for the topic today. Now, we are going to be talking about the motive, social acceptance, and That's why you will see it here. We're going to start going into and see what are the different aspects of this motive. So first and foremost, when you have somebody with a strong motive for social acceptance, it means that they do have a need for perfection and accuracy. Things has to be perfect. It has to be very accurate, because if it is, it's not a mistake. So these are people who will work very meticulously with their projects, whatever that is, or their work task. And again, you can always expect quality output. And this is, again, very, very important to remember, that there's so many functions where you really want these people because they deliver such a perfect job. And again, if you manage it well, you're going to have the most outstanding staff member. You got to remember that they're very self-critic and also always questioning their own quality and ability. And this is part of where you as a manager have to be active in your managing. But again, doing it right, you got the perfect staff member for certain jobs. Now, at the other end of the scale, because remember, all of these work on a continuum. So on the other end of the scale, you will find people who are believe in trial and error. And what they do is they go in there, well, I can make a mistake, it doesn't really matter. And if you give me any negative feedback, any criticism, hey, it's okay. I might go in and argue about it if I disagree, but at least I can take it and you can give it to me pretty direct, because failure is not an option. It is simply just a matter of trying again and then see what happens. So an error in the opposite end of the scale. So you can imagine what that means. Now let's go into more details here. So when we look at the social acceptance score, and you can see here the continuum is marked by the red and the blue. So very often you will hear me refer to them as red on a motive or blue on a motive. And basically it means that when you have a red score, you have a strong need for what the motive is called. And when you go in the blue direction, you have the opposite need. And in this case, for people who are significantly red, they have a strong need for social acceptance. Now, detail-wise, that means perfect result in designs. It has to be perfect. That's the word perfectionism. Putting also extremely high demands on themselves. These are very, very demanding people. You know, they will work really hard to deliver. And this is where you will see that they often are known as really, really quality employees. And again, there is no problem in this. Again, I keep repeating this because so many times I end up seeing people focusing on the negatives. And this is really the wrong way of looking at it. You should look at the positives. They do need the praise. They do need a lot of feedback from you. And they absolutely do want you to make them shine. And again, this is because it will provide them with self-confidence in the context. Core belief here is, I do not want to make a mistake. So let's have, just to put this into perspective and say, what is at the opposite end, at the other end of the continuum? So at the other end, we have people who are not afraid of the unknown because they will simply just dive into it. They believe so much in themselves. I normally, when I make it a little black and white, I like to say that they think they can walk on water. So very high degree of self-assurance, self-confidence, and in the extreme cases, actually too much. So you can, in both extreme cases, have too little or too much. These people are also very good at jumping in where nobody's been before because they're not afraid of using trial and error. So just remember that these people do accept mistakes. They can also be very opinionated. So these are people who need to express themselves and what they believe in. They believe it's right to express themselves. It doesn't mean that they cannot take a discussion. It just means that they will be very assertive and in a very direct manner. And that also, again, means that they're very open to criticism. And because they have a positive self-esteem, criticism doesn't hurt them. Basic belief, I want to do everything. Now, you can imagine that when you put these two up against each other, you're going to have at one end one who likes things to be put in positives, who needs the praise, who needs the encouragement, who needs to belong, meaning also social acceptance, thus the name of the motive. And at the opposite end, you have somebody who's very direct, who needs to express their opinion also when things are not right, because it's not a problem, there's a mistake, and we just point it out and move on. We do see, and I don't have the sort of any sort of norm numbers for this related to leaders, but we do see that many leaders tend to be on the blue side. It doesn't mean you can't be a great leader if you're on the red side. You just see that we look at statistics, we do see somewhat more represented on the blue side in terms of leaders. That means that when they communicate, they're going to be very direct. They're going to point out the mistakes you make. And you can imagine if you're at the opposite end and you are the employee belonging to that boss, you don't need that kind of communication. So this, of course, is a thing to consider. How do you communicate? Where do you think you are here? Are you too direct? Even in indirect cultures, I have seen a lot of people being very direct, because once something goes wrong, they will address it, and in a very harsh way. So just remember that we are opposites, and it has a completely different meaning. We will never be able to understand the emotions of somebody at the opposite end of the scale. We will never be able to do that. So take care, think about who is the receiver. Now, if we dive a little deeper into this, again, the positive here is that you have the perfectionistic striving. I need to accomplish, and I will be very thorough, because if I'm not thorough, mistakes could happen. And again, the positive outcomes really, really generate a lot of motivation inside me. And I want to avoid the mistakes. I have a fear of failure, and I don't need negatively viewed by others. So these are the driving mechanisms. If we then go into the self-perception, and I'm not going to read all these aloud, again, you can read them in the recording afterwards. But when we have people at the red end, people with a strong need for social acceptance, they are very sensitive to criticism. And they are also, for that reason, vulnerable. So you need to give them the praise and the recognition. They need to belong. And if you are not understanding that, and you don't understand how sensitive and vulnerable I am, you will hurt me. Respect is also important, because respect could be perceived as you not accepting me, you pushing me out of the group. So just remember, these are people with very, very high expectations of themselves, because it has to be perfect. Oh, by the way, if you don't know, it's a jaguar in the back. And well, in my private opinion, a very great example of something where hopefully some kind of perfectionist has been involved, because it is for sure a beautiful design. And this is again what we can get when we have perfectionists, because they don't leave any detail unattended, because it has to be perfect. Now, at the opposite end, you have these self-assured people, and I have a very high tolerance for mistakes. So you can criticize me, it doesn't matter, I'll just get back on the horse. And I do believe that we make mistakes and we can learn from them. So it's perfectly okay. Another interesting statement here from the self-perception is that I can't be everybody's darling, meaning if we're not necessarily getting along, if you're criticizing me, hey, so be it. I don't need to be friends with everybody. I know myself, I know what I stand for, and that's it, I'm me. So, and again, here, if you start talking about mistakes between these two opposing factors, then one can laugh at mistakes and the other one think it's the end of the world. So definitely they can have a hard time communicating and seeing the beauty of each other. Then when we go into how to lead them, and this is again where you have to think a lot about how you do. So I just listed a few things here, but we're going to talk more in detail about it, because it's so important that you understand the quality of having these in your team, but also where you might make a mistake in your leadership. So first and foremost, they need lots of positive feedback, and that positive feedback is what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. So For those of you who like to know more about feedback, we're going to give you an insight to the feedback cycles that we also use in our trainings, so that you have a structure for an ongoing feedback culture. And this is so important because you may not need it. If you happen to be blue on social acceptance, meaning you have the opposite need of the red, then you don't need so much feedback. You can take critique, you can even ask for critique when you need it, but you don't really need it, and when you need it, you don't need it so often. And it doesn't have to be positive. You might disagree when it's not positive, you might even disagree when it is positive, but you really don't need it. And here is the pitfall. Because you don't need it at the blue end, you might also not be so good at giving. And this is what I've heard for so many years. I started in leadership consulting some roughly 25 years ago. And I have been involved in recruiting and leadership development and talent development ever since, also assessments. And what I keep hearing is about how leaders are not good enough at giving feedback. And often when we come out and we're interviewing a new client and their staff about what's needed in a new leader, they always stress this. Well, it has to be somebody who's really good at giving feedback. But at the end of the day, many leaders are not. And this doesn't come from a negative. It comes from the fact that most leaders do not need it themselves so much. So you can see the dilemma in here. If I don't need it, I'm like, yeah, I just gave you feedback. I think it was like 2 weeks ago. And now you want it again. And I even have to focus on the positive. You can imagine what starts building inside this person needs it all the time. But at the end of the day, for the person at the other end, it's like every 2 weeks may not be enough, because I get uneasy, I get insecure. Am I moving in the right direction? Am I doing what my boss is expecting? I'm not hearing anything. Now, here is the positive of receiving this feedback, is that they can quickly adjust. Whereas if you have people who don't need so much feedback, they may be just running ahead of you, but not necessarily in the right direction, because they're not asking for it and nobody's giving. So when we realize they have gone on for 2 weeks in the wrong direction, it may be too late. So again, by you increasing your frequency of feedback, you will see a positive, because you can keep people better in control and on the track. And that's what it's about. Not the control for the sake of control, but for the sake of keeping them on track. So this is really important that you understand with yourself what is your personal need for this. And then you look at your team and saying, okay, am I giving them enough feedback? Now, a lot of people are assuming this thing. So again, my recommendation to all leaders, and I do this in all trainings I do, is remember, do not assume, ask. It is the simplest way to understand people's personal needs, because your team will be very different. Some will have a high need, some will have a low need for feedback. So ask them, either in your one-on-ones or over a cup of coffee or in a team meeting. But in a team meeting, you may not get fully openness around it unless you have a very open culture. So just take people, grab them by the coffee machine. By the way, I have a question for you. If you think about the feedback I'm giving you, would you like to have more or less? Or is there anything I can do about it? This is a much better way than assuming. And when you assume or start generalizing on your team, you're going to make mistakes. So this is a very, very important aspect. Another thing that's important is if a person who has a strong need for social acceptance makes a mistake or something didn't go as planned, they are their hardest critics. So if you start telling them what you think and how this went wrong, and you're pointing out the mistakes, it's way too direct. So first of all, appreciate them for what they did that worked. So open up, take the ease off, give them a little bit of peace at heart, and then ask them for self-evaluation. Remember, they're going to be tough on themselves because they want it perfect, and if it wasn't perfect, they are their own biggest critic. So ask them for self-evaluation. How do you think it went? Okay, and then they will self-evaluate, and then you can even ask them, so what would you do different next time? And you can then evaluate whether you need to input something or they have already said everything that needs to be said. This way, you are not stepping in the role of the aggressor in their perception. On the contrary, you can be the supporting person, helping them get to where they want to go. And this is, again, something that unfortunately I see very often people don't understand this. So because it's so much faster just to give the direct feedback, this went wrong, you did this. And then we're already having a negative outcome. So allow yourself the time, be patient. Now, another thing which is important is that if you are looking over their shoulders, they can get nervous because, again, they want to be perfect. So they need to live up to expectations, but you got to remember again here that it's their expectations. This is where you have to align expectations. So once you put them on a new task, a new assignment, give them a new goal, you have to be very clear in the definition. What do you expect from them? What is it you want, and what is a good enough result? Because remember, they will be striving for minimum 100%. So you got to define what's the perfect result, and then they will start working towards that. Another thing, and this is something I've seen unfortunately also at close hand, is people who are perfectionists are easy to stress and potentially get burnout. Why? Okay, let's look at that because this is important. Remember, they want to be perfect. That requires time. Because if you put too many tasks on top of each other and you keep pushing them with too short deadlines, there isn't enough time for perfection. At the same time, these are very often people who want to please you. Because again, they want to make you happy so that they feel belonging and appreciation. If you start pushing them and handing them more tasks than there's time for, when you think about it from the perfect standpoint, they will try to cope. But how do they do that? They do that by throwing in more effort, more hours. And then it's going to be like burning the candle in both ends. So rather, you should think about what are the tasks where I need it to be perfect, and then make sure that you don't overload them with tasks in that same period. Because if you do, you will stress. And stress leads in the beginning to great results, but over time it's going to develop the negatives of stress, which again could actually mean loss of concentration, headaches, whatever, and this will then lead to more mistakes, in which case the world ends for these people if they are strong enough in the need for social acceptance. So you should think about the task you are delegating, and then you should think about what is a realistic time frame for this, how much time should I allocate for each of these, and then stop when they're full. Do not overload. There are other people you can overload, the people at the opposite end, because, hey, they can do with 95% and maybe even 90% and still be okay. And most often, we can manage with 90-95% easily, but not for these people. So think about where is it necessary. And then, because perfection is so important, you also have to think about how can these people optimize themselves and how can they get better skills so that they can even do better. This is very, very important for them. So they're typically focused, not driven by the curiosity, which could also be looking at learning more, but these will definitely be looking at how can I hone in on my professional skills. And this is something you have to provide them, either through what training you can give them, help them with, that will definitely make them feel good, but also what other trainings are necessary for them to go to even better, higher levels. So just a few advices. We could go on, the list is much longer, but these are some of the things I find most important. So just to recap a little bit here. So lots of frequent positive feedback, and you may actually, when you're doing that, you may receive resistance because they may start doubting whether you actually mean it. So think also about how you say it when you say it, and just accept that there might be a little resistance, just keep doing it because it's so important. Also make sure that if there is something that goes wrong, ask for self-evaluation. And then probably the most important advice I can give you is think about the task and make sure that there's time enough, and then they will deliver the perfect performance, the perfect delivery. And this is why I think that these people are so great to have in the team, because they can do things, for instance, where I would stop way before. And I need people like this around me as well to support me, because I don't necessarily need to go all the way. I also then have to understand that if I give them a time frame, I cannot come 2 days before and say, where is it? Because I did give them more time, and typically they will even ask for more time, because we could optimize a little bit. So any given task where you need optimization, these are some of the people you can look for, because they will scrutinize where can we do it better, how can we do it better, and see another benefit of having perfectionists in your team when you manage them correctly. So that ends today's session, and I hope you just got a little bit more insight to what it means to be a perfectionist. What are the driving forces? Also, where are the sort of we could say the weak areas where you need to support them, and how can you get really the best and the benefit without stressing, without risking some of your staff members going on long-term sick leave with stress or burnout. Tomorrow, we're going to continue this talk, because we're going to be talking about how to deliver good feedback. And this is linked very much into today's session. Friday, as I said, caught by assumptions. And then again, a little marketing. I will post it soon on LinkedIn and Facebook, so you can start signing up. But virtual leadership on Monday, overcoming team differences. And then we had a new suggestion, more about self-leadership, who and I, and how to manage myself. So that will be on Friday. You can see we still have 2 open slots. So if you have any suggestions, please, please, please email me, and I'm more than happy to look at it if it's something we can provide. So with those words, I will say thank you for today, shut down the recording, and in case any of you have any questions, please hang around, and then we can go on with